G'day, how you going? In this video I'm going to be painting a Terminator from the Brotherhood of Darkness warband of Chaos Space Marines. So for this colour scheme I chose to prime in a grey to begin with. Personally I just like using grey, but given this model is going to be predominantly black, it would make sense to start from a black primer too. Either way, you're going to have to get a base layer of black down on the model, and for the black I wanted for this model, Doom Death Black from Two Thin Coats would work perfectly. Depending on your chosen primer, you may need a couple of layers before you get a solid colour, but keep it thin and let each layer dry before adding another. So once the black is done, I began working on some of the red areas of the model, and for some reason this warband uses red in the rubber areas between plating from what I could see on the artwork. But anyway, for this and the trim I chose Asmodeus Red from the Two Thin Coats range. It's a nice brownish dark red to give a bit of depth and also to tie in nicely with the black. I know there is a method for getting the trim done first with Chaos Marines and then fill in the flat surfaces, and in most cases I do use that method, but honestly being able to just get the black down nice and quick, then carefully go over any trim that was easily accessible probably saved time in the end. Be sure to tidy up any black areas here if needed before moving on to some Emperor Red from Two Thin Coats. Now with the Emperor Red, I chose to go over most of the Asmodeus Red, leaving only the deepest areas untouched. Don't go too thin with it, 1 to half of paint to water I reckon would be the sweet spot here. It works really well with the Asmodeus Red undercoat. But if you've only got Citadel paints available, I'd say your closest replicas would probably be Khorne Red instead of the Asmodeus, and maybe Wazdaka Red instead of Emperor Red. Now here I just thinned down some black red from AK Interactive just to wash into the little areas that were rubber. Only really because washes tend to have a little bit of a glossy look. But for the trim on the armour, I preferred that shine look, so here I used Carroburg Crimson Wash and gave all the trim a decent dose. I don't think I really watered it down much, if at all really, but just as always, be sure to not let it pool too much. And as a little side tip, you can see there that I'm kind of guiding the wash away from the very tips. That sort of just helps with edge highlighting later on and helps with a little bit more of a more natural looking blend between shadow and highlight. Now starting on that highlight, I used Demon Red from Two Thin Coats and begun carefully running it along the edges of the trim. This will take time, and be sure to keep the paint more controlled here, so not as much thinning as usual. I'm talking almost not at all, really. The best tip I could give with edge highlighting is thicker paint but less of it. So very little on your brush at all, maybe just enough to make one pass or stroke with the brush, then return to the palette and get just enough for another pass and so on. It's really not the best way to explain it because everyone knows painting with unthinned paint will land you not only with a very strongly worded letter but also a less appealing finished layer on your model. But if the paint is too thin, it won't hold its line and will run off your edge. And it doesn't help that nearly all paints behave differently, so just experiment first, find that sweet spot and go from there. And if that wasn't painful enough, a final edge highlight of Centurion Red from Two Thin Coats was used on the sharpest areas of the trim. Beware though, it says red, but it really did push towards orange with just a little bit of a nudge, so be very sparing with where you choose to go with this colour. And it may have seemed like a lot, but honestly it didn't take as long as I thought. Be selective with that Centurion Red, and you may even have to cut down half the time because you really don't need too much of it. Now in true Chaos fashion, we go from one side of the headache to now the other, edge highlighting the black, but really don't overdo it. I've seen some black models absolutely covered in edge highlight and it begins shifting away from black and looks just a little too unrealistic. Unless the model was under a fluorescent light in every angle, You don't need every area highlighted. At least that's what I told myself for this model. Now I used Death Reaper from Two Thin Coats as the first colour before moving on to Mechanicus Standard Grey from Citadel, being sure to make the Death Reaper line thicker and the Mechanicus Standard Grey line fit inside it to build a progressive highlight. And just like the Centurion Red before, I did a very small selective edge highlight of Vallejo Natural Grey and just dotted it in some of the very sharp black edges. Again, not needed if you don't want to. So to sum up, you can see the grey edge highlights are mainly on actual edges and not up against the red. It saves a lot of time in general, but also it depends on the look you're going for. Now to begin on some of the silver areas, I used AK Interactive's Oily Steel. But I only really used it on the chainmail and on these mechanical little bits on the armour. I left the weapons untouched. Giving all the areas a couple of coats just to get a nice even layer before moving on to a wash of Nuln Oil from Citadel. Once that was dry, I added a coat of Agrax Earthshade from Citadel just to give them more of a dirty and grimy look. Skulls. Now these guys had a few from what I could see on the artwork, and honestly some of these could have been done red with the trim, but it kind of left the model a little colourless, so I chose the one on his knee and the one on his chest, giving them a couple of coats of Skeleton Legion from Two Thin Coats. I then used Proacryl's brown wash and added it to the recesses of the skulls. Now he's got a couple of demon looking skull things on his armour. Now I chose to do these in a blackened sort of demon flesh as opposed to bone. And for these I started with a base coat of Abaddon Black from Citadel before giving them a couple of layers over in the raised areas with Rubber Black from AK Interactive. I returned to the skulls again once the wash was dry with a layer of the Skeleton Legion, just glazing over the top areas to build up that layer where the wash had settled too much. Before again switching back to the demon skulls with Mechanicus Standard Grey just to add that final highlight to the black. I then began the highlighting process on the skulls using Buff from AK Interactive, using this colour to help establish the lines that are going to be highlighted even further using Ivory Tusk from Two Thin Coats range to define those sharp edges on the skulls. Now moving to his cloth here at the front, this really could have been any colour, but I chose red. And here I used a wine red from AK Interactive to get a solid base colour down. I then shaded it with violet red from AK Interactive before moving to carmine red from also AK Interactive and build up that edge sort of highlighted colour. Leaving predominantly the violet red untouched and just mainly highlighting up on that wine red previously to help build that natural blend. I also used Rubber Black from AK Interactive to build in that very deep recessed shadow on the cloth. Before returning to Carmine Red once more just to sort of emphasise the highlighted areas of the cloth. I chose to keep it more to the cold red colours here just to differentiate it from the armour trim, and I think it turned out pretty cool. And now the boring stuff we all have to do. Starting on the metals with the weapons, I used AK Interactive's gun metal and used it all over the sword and the gun, leaving the hilt of the sword untouched though, and also all over the spikes on the back. I then gave all these areas with a trusty wash of the Nuln Oil. I have no idea why, but I broke out my trusty brightest silver from Vallejo, I think it's called Air Silver, and ran it over all the edges of the sword. Before moving on to some of the gold areas, including the skull in the sword and all over the combi bolter casing, and here I used Retributor armor from Citadel. I then gave all the gold areas a heavy wash of Agrax Earthshade just to sort of dull them down a bit. Again, I don't know why, but the Brotherhood of Darkness seem to have apparently gold casings on their weapons. I then touched up some of these areas on the weapons with some oily steel back again, and then edge highlighted the gold on the weapon casing with the same colour. Now, I don't know the vibe you guys are getting from this warband, but they're screaming more vampire vibes than Night Lord and Blood Angel combined. So I thought it only fitting to give the hilt of the sword a nice red colour. So once again, using Asmodeus Red from Two Thin Coats, I layered the hilt of the sword before covering it with Noan Oil, and then using Sanguinine Scarlet from Two Thin Coats and adding a edge highlight to all the raised areas. I then used Rust Orange from Two Thin Coats as a final edge highlight in all the sharpest raised areas. I started on the skin with Ivory Tusk from Two Thin Coats, just to sort of emphasize that vampire sort of vibe I was picking up on. And once I had a couple of solid thin coats, I used German Field Grey from AK Interactive, watered down to a wash consistency to give a little bit of texture and colour to the face. And just a quick wash of ultramarine blue contrast over the silver for the trophies on the back here. I think we'll do just fine. I wanted to spend more time on the model and figured the helmet had been there for a while anyway. Now, the iconic signature look of the Brotherhood of Darkness is these script-like symbols embedded into their armor, and these are totally random and scattered all over the miniature. There's no real obvious pattern or rule to these symbols, just make up anything you like the look of and start stenciling them in with white. I then traced over the same symbols with Bad Moon Yellow contrast paint from Citadel just to give them that bright yellow fiery look. Before then moving to Gryph-hound Orange contrast paint just to give them a little bit more of a texture like heat. Before finishing off the raised areas with some Retributor Armor Gold. And there we go, a Terminator from the Brotherhood of Darkness warband. These guys are an old colour scheme I found back in 5th edition Chaos Codex, and I did have a test model from years ago that I did and I liked the look of and wanted to give it a go again. I had to also hand paint the wings on their emblem, as to my disappointment at the end of a long paint job, the Night Lord's emblem had the wings going the opposite direction, and so I could not use theirs. Anyway, I really hope you liked it. Please let me know what you think down below in the comments. Reach out if you have any suggestions. I will always reply and happy to take on new challenges. Thanks again.